joined by Roy Gluckman, who is a trailblazing DEI speaker or inclusion expert, having performed quite a multitude of impactful work over the years, spanning quite multiple years.
Yeah.
We're honored today to have a conversation about what more conversations we need to have as the industry matures into growing numbers of support globally and also locally. Thank you so much, Roy, for joining us.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Ad Ideas podcast.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and how has the journey been since?
I mean, I started when it was just called diversity training. That's what it was. It was diversity training. It was like over a decade ago. And it was like, it was just talks, you know. I mean, if I think of the first men and women who went into organizations to talk about our differences, particularly in South Africa, like those were real trailblazers. Like, let's talk about race.
Yeah.
Even in transition, even before transition. So even when I entered, like there was still some awareness, but like diversity training, right? And then diversity became inclusion, and inclusion became equity, and now equity is becoming belonging, and you know, it's kind of just
morphed into
Totally. I mean, now we're talking about things like psychological safety and justice, which is quite a big shift from where we started. Just like thinking about our differences, you know, now it's like very psychological.
I mean, almost a decade ago, it was quite a new, I'd say, phenomenon. We've had a Trump era whereby a lot of reversals happened, and we've had a lot of recurrence of justice or play fallout in different jurisdictions.
Yeah.
You look at Ghana, Uganda, you look at so many landscapes globally. How do we make sense of those shifts?
I think it's been quite interesting just to look at the category as a whole. So you're right. Like, let's talk about like 10 years ago was really, let's even call it 8 years ago, the DEI heyday. It was like this new thing that had grown in importance, and it was really like this swell of this wave, and like everyone wanted it. They didn't really know what it was. Like there was no dealing with DEI leads within organizations. You know, it was kind of like everyone was figuring it out. Even we as providers were kind of figuring it out. We knew kind of what we were doing and where it fit to kind of get to this point now where DEI is now mainstream. And what I've noticed, which is I guess cool and very irritating at the same time, is that because DEI is now mainstream, there's been a deprioritization of it, right? Now we have ESG and sustainability, you know, those are the new kids on the block. That's the kind of swell that's building. And then DEI, I guess like most things, kind of gets pushed inside. Oh yeah, no, we'll do it. Yeah. But like it's not a priority for us this year. You know, it gets put into that cycle of priority. So as a provider, that sucks. And I guess it's a little bit worrying in a sense, but good in that we there's still a place. We just now need to, I think the work on providers, or the way I see it, is really doing the work of linking DEI to performance, which I don't think in the heyday of DEI we had to do, right? Because it was the right thing to do. Social justice, make everyone feel good, you know, and that was enough to get us in the door because it was like buzzwordy and it was cool. Now that we've been kind of mainstreamed, we actually have to be showing performance and business results. So the war on DEI in the global north, which is now like beginning, I think is as a result of us not doing that, showing business results, right? Performance results. And it's no failure of the category. I just think that is, I mean, I always think about how complex change is in organizations. And I think DEI providers, particularly in the global north, overpromised, you know, like this is what it's going to do. And actually change is incredibly complex. And then when we didn't see those results and we didn't feel good because we talk about hard stuff, we could say, oh, this is actually bad for us. I am thinking a lot about like, you know, because Global South, we're always a little bit further behind in terms of like the cultural uptake of the Global North. Will the war on DEI come to South Africa? I would imagine so. Is it going to be the same? Probably not. But I'm interested to see what it's going to be. Who's going to drive the attack on DEI in South Africa? I can't think it's going to be white people. I'm like, who is it going to be? Because it's going to come, right? So I don't yet know what it's going to look like here. I'm sure it will get here. Or maybe like our constitution will be something that beats it out, where it's just like, sorry, like this is important, this is who we are, you know. The first line of the constitution is, we the people recognize the injustices of our past. That's what DEI is about. So I don't know. I'm interested to see what it looks like. But as a provider for me now, it's like, okay, how do I convince you and show you and measure that what we do within your organization has like real performance and operational impact? That's critical.
And you talk about not the legal landscape in a way. You come from a legal landscape your own self. How does that marry and tie into what you are doing now? Is there like a disconnect almost, looking at your journey like professionally, or is there still a marriage in a way, or a connectedness?
I think I see my legal training purely as the genesis, as the starting point, you know. So, I mean, in terms of my story, because, you know, white guy doing diversity and inclusion work, what's that about? What is that about? And it's good to kind of be skeptical, because a lot of people are like, oh, that's cool, or oh, that's really like inclusive. And some people are like, no. Is he part of the gold rush of DEI, where it's like, you know, there's money to be made here? All valid, all important to kind of look at and to address. But kind of my entry point into D&I work was through studying law, right? It was like realizing that, or rather having the space to run to my internal monsters, right? My own beliefs of prejudice, my own beliefs of superiority, my own bias, my own beliefs that being a white man means there's no opportunity for me in South Africa and in the world, my own anxieties around that, my own fear around that. So constitutional law, which was part of that law program, was really just an opportunity for me to look at, and the answer was overwhelmingly no. And that kind of space that was created in that class, where they weren't telling you how to be, they were just like, here's some interesting things to think about, what do you think? That's kind of been a model for me to recreate. So if anything, it's not so much that I'm grounded in a legal understanding of this work, that is there. I'm trying to recreate the power of like social justice education and what it can do from a liberation perspective, right? Because yes, oppression is, you know, victimhood is confining, but like privilege has not the same, but is also, I kind of think of privilege as like a young boy under his duvet on his bed, right? That's what it's like. You're frightened of the things around you.
It's like a bubble.
It's total bubble, and it's a frightened bubble, right? So yes, it's a better bubble to be in, for sure, but like there's still a sense of like you're trapped, it's claustrophobic, it's frightening, everything outside is scary. So for me, it's like thinking about the power of social justice education to liberate.
And talking about those internal conversations, you've become a speaker as well. One of the thought leading speakers on this subject matter, not communicating about the training, for example, advocating that, you know, in-person training is almost unscalable in a way, and you've created now Run to the Monster.
Yeah.
What are some of the conversational self-talks that you are inspired by from that journey of your own genesis, that you want to tell other people who are probably entrapped, as I say, in their own bubbles?
I think for me, what Run to the Monster, what I'm kind of focusing on, right? And I'm going to use a controversial or a political metaphor of a vaccine. So not a COVID vaccine, just how vaccines work, right? So there's like two incredibly important components of a vaccine. The first one is this vaccine, this molecule, this substance that we are putting in the body, does it work? And we put a lot of research and effort into this, and great minds and scientists, and like we looking at that microscope and we're getting the perfect component to do what it needs to do, right? We get that. But the other aspect of a successful vaccine, equally as important as this very, very powerful, well-researched molecule, is how do we get it into the body? Like, you can have the best molecule ever, but like if you're not getting it into my body, it's not going to work. And I think as providers, as D&I providers, rightly so, we have focused on the molecule, the learning. How do we create change? How do we create an emotion? How do we tell a story? How do we get people to reflect? And we spend a lot of time there, and we've taken our eye off like, wait, how are we actually going to get this into the organization? Like effectively. And I don't think we've done it effectively. So part of what I think the war on DEI in the global north is talking about, was like those training spaces were harmful. And if you look at those spaces, particularly from an in-person perspective, we loved them. They were cool. There were opportunities for us to connect, 4 hours, 8 hours, day and a half, 2-day offsites, right? That's what we do. And we tell our stories and it'd be great. And like we'd feel things and we would learn. But like you scratch a little bit deeper, those spaces were actually quite terrifying. I think for white people, for men, for straight people, for able-bodied people, entered those spaces convinced that they were going to be told that they were baddies, or guilty coming in that they were going to be called out, worried to say the wrong thing, worried to be perceived in a certain way. And then of course you had people of color, women, queer people, people with disabilities, like, oh gosh, am I going to have to share my pain and my trauma and like how I don't fit in? And what if I'm like, every time I've done, like there's baggage there as well. So as lovely as those spaces were, and we loved it. We loved hearing people's stories. That is important. Am I convinced those are the best spaces to learn? I don't know. So when I'm thinking about like DEI work and what I want to take, like thinking about that social justice learning, where I'm focused on at the moment is cool. The molecule is there, right? But how are we getting this into the organizational body? How are we creating spaces where learning is prioritized rather than the content is prioritized, right? So learning being different from the content. Because I just don't think that, we're never going to get
a perfect combination.
Absolutely not. And also, I just also don't think we're going to be getting huge organizational in-person training rollouts. I think it's dead. In which case, what do? We start, we need to innovate around how it is we're getting this in. And technology allows us interesting ways to do that.
What would you say are the most urgent conversations that we need to have, like from this year onwards? We are in a year of change. South Africa is in its unique era of change. What would you say are the pivotal connections that we have to talk about?
I think the intersectionality is increasingly becoming very interesting in the South African conversation. Let's take International Women's Day, which happened on the 8th of March now, right?
Yeah.
I'll talk about a session that happened last year at one of the big banks. We were in a panel, and I was hosting this panel, and it was actually a panel with some of the male leaders, right? And that was by design. We were like, where does the work need to happen? It needs to happen with men. Great, cool. And what kind of came out in that panel of these men, and I'm facilitating this process, and we've heard this before, is, let's say for Black women, talking about International Women's Day cannot be separated, of course, from Blackness. Yet for the experience of some Black men or men of color within organizations, it's kind of like, can we just sort the race thing out and then we can get to the gender thing, right? It's kind of like, we're coming now, but let's just get this sorted out. Now, of course, that's a privileged position, right? And that's how it always operates. Like, let's just deal with our stuff first and then we'll get to yours. And I think the conversation of intersectionality is becoming just increasingly more important, that like, we can't just look at the race thing. We can't just look at this gender thing. Like, we have to understand that these things are interconnected. So your experience, let's say, as a man of color is valid in terms of your oppression within the space and your internalized oppression, but like so too is your privilege, and how do we hold that complexity? So I think the South African conversation is evolving to bring in some of those nuances, like holding both privilege and oppression at the same time. Wow, that's a real thing. Ooh, that's uncomfortable, right? Yeah, that is. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that.
And you feel like the intersectional conversation, particularly with people who hold multiple layered both and would you say that there's more insecurity about talking the privilege side, whereas it's much enjoyable to always want to be the victim?
Sure.
Because you get the attention, like, okay, this is struggle, it's got to be better prioritized because the victim is, we want to rescue the victim in a way.
Sure.
What would you say, or would you describe the transitional conversation towards intersection to be?
Well, if you think of privilege as power, like, power exists by remaining invisible, right? So privilege doesn't really want to be visible because then we have to address it. So it's not so much that people want to talk about their oppression to be victims. It's more like, that's where I feel my pain, and it's more recognizable. And also, I don't want to talk about my privilege because like it must remain invisible. So, it's like, so kind of in a roundabout way, I think that of course it's way more difficult to talk about our privilege within those spaces, but I think even more so, it's difficult to talk about the intersection of my privilege and my oppression.
Yeah.
It's like that thing is confusing. It is complex. However, like I think the conversations I'm seeing Black people in South Africa Black and colored people in South Africa have a bit more comfort with it, because particularly from a socioeconomic status, like there are young Black professionals saying, to use their words, I'm Black, but I'm not like black. You know, there's like this distinction from a socioeconomic status where someone can say, I'm a Black woman, but I went to formal modesty and private schooling. So they can hold that complexity. But some identities don't know how to do it all.
So there's a class narrative in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. Like they can see even, so there's a comfort there. But for some identities, like just holding both is too much.
Yeah.
And maybe, and I'm just kind of, in some ways, intersectionality, I don't know, some people see it as like diluting the conversation, right? So if we can spread our gaze across multiple issues, it can split our focus so we're not fighting one issue, right? So like if we're looking at all the intersections, we kind of like send the troops everywhere rather than all of us focusing the troops on race. You know, I mean, is that true? I don't know necessarily. Maybe it's all kind of done together. But yeah, I mean, I think there's sometimes an anxiety around even just talking about how, you know, if we're taking our eye off the fact that there is racial issues and to talk about gender, like, do we dilute? I don't know. It's complex. I
mean, Ed got into ESG. I mean, you touched on sustainability being the star child now.
Yeah.
You know, so when you look at the S part of ESG, I think there's a room for us to better stress out the DEI narrative, particularly intersectionality, in that S. How would you say would be the opportunity or the big win right now for us to integrate that?
I mean, I don't know how people are even seeing that as separate. I'm surprised that DEI hasn't been brought into that S already. Maybe the question that you're asking, you must tell me, at the end of the day, it kind of feels like where are we getting budget from within the organization, right? Sometimes it feels like a budget allocation. Like the work needs to be done. Call it HR, call it DEI, call it transformation, call it S in ESG. Who cares? It needs to be done, right? And it's all kind of the same work. But where are we getting budget from? Where are we getting capacity to do this? So it's quite difficult, I think, for me as a provider to separate out the ambition and the aspiration and the starry-eyed, this is what we're going to do, versus the reality of the South African space. Cost-cutting, limited capacity, big dreams. So for me, it's like, cool, let's actually work to bring that DEI into the S if it's going to get us budget. But I mean, I also think that these things are euphemisms. So ESG is, what is it a euphemism for? Isn't it kind of a sustainability? I'm like, I don't know. You know, the space is also something which is evolving, and my understanding needs to grow around ESG as well. But yeah, I do think we need to bring it in because it is all part of it. But, you know, organizations are siloed, and even we as practitioners, as DEI practitioners, don't like collaborating that much.
I think it's also almost like from hand to mouth situation.
Sure.
You know, it's like, okay, if you get that, I mean, what incentive is there for another company to hire two DI practitioners?
Yeah.
You know, there's kind of like that narrative and that reality almost. I think it's almost the same with inclusion, how people view inclusion. That, for example, if I have to bring more people to the table, someone has to lose a table.
Yeah.
How would you describe that work?
Fundamental fuck up that is capitalism. Like, that is it, right? It's designed to make us believe that there is not enough of all of us, right? That there is a scarcity of anything. So I think that the scarcity of resources within organizations, of course, limits our ability to information share and to collaborate. We don't necessarily want to. So
if I have to bring someone to the table, like let's say more women of color, more people with disabilities, more people of color, does that mean now the board of comprised of 10 men? Or white men. Yeah. Does that mean like all 10 must go?
You know? Well, I mean, this kind of thing of scarcity and like there not being enough, or if you want, I have to give something up, right? I have to lose something. I think there's a couple of things, and it's something that I have thought about a lot and think about a lot and kind of leaning into quite a lot in terms of my practice into 2024 and beyond, is thinking about loss and grief. I'm like very obsessed with this idea of like transition, loss and grief, because let's talk about allyship. Evan's like, how do we become an ally? Like, give me the 5 things to be a better ally. Cool, like we can do this, right? But we know that allyship is actually a transformational experience, right? So for me in that law class, I had a transformational experience that pulled me into this idea of allyship, right? This work as an ally. So we can't recreate that within organizations because multiple things need to happen. So like, when we're thinking about allyship, for me, yes, we can do the storytelling, really, really important, but then it like feels conceptual. Like I hear the story, I understand conceptually why it is that we need to drive for racial justice. Cool, I get it. But like experientially, I don't necessarily have that. One of the keys for me, for us to be thinking about to kind of get me a little bit over that line is to talk about grief. Have I, as a white person or as a man, sat with the grief of losing something in the pursuit of justice, of equality?
Yeah.
Have I sat with the grief, the loss, the fear that if I drive for gender equality, my boys may not have the same opportunity? Because if we're not creating the space like that in the conversation, I can be conceptually in it. Oh yeah, of course we want that. But like, how I'm going to be behaving consciously, subconsciously is one from fear. It's not going to be one that says there is enough. It's going to be like, there isn't actually enough for everyone. And by me driving this agenda, consciously or unconsciously, I am taking away from me and my future. And as a result, I am going to frustrate that. So I love the conversation around grief and loss and transition. I think it's super, super important.
And touching to the transitional journey, we are talking about social justice. I mean, it's emerging quite topically, given the social ills now that are rising. How would we describe the social transition towards social justice, towards increased social justice? You know, we have GBV right now in South Africa being quite at a pandemic level. What transitions do we need to have to go towards the social justice landscape?
So I don't know. I don't think that there is a single way for us to do this. I guess maybe what's coming to me is always this idea of scarcity. That I think if we exist in spaces with scarce resources, and let's maybe think of resources more broadly, not just access to housing, healthcare, food, jobs, though that is important. Like, what is like a psychological resource? Like, what is wellness as a resource? What is mental health as a resource? Like, so in a space where there's the scarcity, of course we are going to protect and dominate, right? I mean, a colleague of mine and I were talking like, what is this fundamental human need of human beings to dominate? It's a very particular need. Like, where does that come from? Like, did capitalism evolve as a result of our need to dominate? Or does our need to dominate kind of create systems like feudal systems, like capitalism, where we create social hierarchy of dominance and oppression? Like, what is it? Like, what is first? I don't know. Is it in our human nature to kind of drive Ubuntu? I'm not 100% sure. I don't actually have an answer. It's really, really difficult. But I guess from a social justice perspective, I mean, I think the obvious answer, like education, awareness, but I don't know.
There's no guarantee with either.
No, I mean, I think there's a scarcity. I think what scarcity creates is it creates just an intense anxiety, and it just creates a soloed, individualistic understanding of the world. And rightly so, it's survival. And I think a survival instinct is counter to a communitarian instinct.
So I think in the world of scarcity, how do we create opportunities? I mean, beyond just, economic merits.
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, if you think of Maslow, I mean, where is wellness and mental health? It's quite high up. I think in South Africa, where we haven't necessarily got some of those foundational needs, people are like, I think wellness is pretty low down on my priority list. I think like a job, so I think it's hard going for us. I think this is where, of course, our history catches up with us, and that is, there is just no way that we can be thinking about self-actualization where we exist in a country that historically has been denied the basics, fundamentals to have a good life. And of course that plays out in our workplace. Of course that comes into our workplace. Absolutely. How can it not? I think it even corrupts those who are higher up, right? It corrupts how it is we, like as a white man, to see me as not having opportunities in South Africa is a corruption. It's an error in view. And yet it was so real. There's not enough for me.
Well, now looking into South Africa, there's change happening. Yeah. You know, and we're going to elections, one of our biggest all eyes election.
Yeah, it's 30 years into democracy.
What are some of the excited changes that you want to, or hopeful of at least?
Oh God, you're asking the wrong person. I mean, up until like 3 weeks ago, I had decided not to vote.
Okay.
And like in my mind, it was, I mean, this is quite a vulnerable share because I think like I understand how a young white man saying this is perceived, but like here we are. Like I think I was like, no, I'm not voting. There was a protest. And of course, I know that not voting is saying something, is a vote in a sense. And I told my friend this and she sat down and she's like, listen, this approach, this kind of not voting, this kind of want to disconnect from something, want to disconnect from the pain and the struggle that is the South African society, and like take this from where this comes, right? This is like this very privileged white man saying, oh, you know, it would just come confusing for me as well. You know, she's like, it's like nihilistic. It's like everything is meaningless, everything is lost. I think for me, when I think of where I'm at just in this work, like as somebody who's been doing this work with the view of impact and change and believing in the impact and change, and then being so confronted with the reality of a system day in and day out of how complex change is, physically, emotionally, psychologically, financially, experientially, temporally in terms of time. It's so difficult that there's a kind of a jaded thing that kind of started happening with me. I was like, am I even in the business of change? Am I actually just doing this for the money, right? There was a kind of this like questioning, like what is the point when it's so difficult? As like a little example, doing this big project with this organization, interest, we're doing this, change, but money, we're ready, let's go, everyone's in, we have buy-in. Midway through the project, holding company in Germany, sorry, we're closing down half the plant. And like all the change that we wanted to do and had done, wiped out, gone. Because now we have lost half the plant and it's like, I must now do culture change. What do you mean? And it was just such a stark reminder of how complex change is, that there's multiple facets. So I felt and become increasingly jaded about this idea of change. So when I think about Run to the Monster, my current thing that I'm thinking about, like how I keep myself doing this work, is I've disconnected from change. In that I say, I am not in control of change. I cannot control change at all. But what I can control is learning. So how does that translate into my awareness as a South African? I wish I had like some big insights, but like I'm struggling, you know, I'm struggling because I'm like, who am I in this space? Who do I want to be? Do I even want to be somebody within this space? And I've been wanting to talk about this a lot, so it feels quite cathartic for me to say this, but like I'm heartbroken. And that heartbreak has brought about a huge amount of anger. And that anger has wanted to disconnect. Well, fuck you. Like I'm not going to vote because actually no one represents me. It's all a waste of time anyway. What's the point? You know, I'm just going to feather my nest so that I'm okay, which is exactly the behavior and the kind of thinking of scarcity that I find so frustrating. But I'm now living it. I'm like, oh, I see what my parents did, what they were saying. They're like, forget about you. And it's a cuck way to live. It's not what we need. And so at least kind of I've moved out of that like nihilistic, everything is meaningless. I'm like out of that now, thank you to my friend. And now I'm trying to figure out, okay, well, who am I? I'm heartbroken, that I know. And I'm just going to sit with that for a while. I'm heartbroken. And that's it. That's what I got.
Is the heartbreak maybe tied towards the lack of a savior in the political landscape or that in the opportunity value chain?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, that's totally, you know, the heartbreak is... It's not necessarily like, yeah, I mean, like I've just recently relocated down to Cape Town and I mean, Joburg is heartbreaking.
Yeah.
because it had like I was, I've lived in Joburg my whole life. I remember being in my like mid-20s when Joburg was making its big comeback, right, the inner city, and like there was this insane energy about Johannesburg. And then, of course, things happened, including the pandemic. It's not only about politics, but it does play a big role. And Joburg broke all of our hearts because it's just a different space now, right? So, yeah, there's a political thing, heartbroken at our history, I guess, constantly, heartbroken at the behaviors that we're seeing, heartbroken that most of my friends don't live here anymore, that my family don't live here anymore. It's so yes, definitely there's a political heartbreak, but there's a loss of a promise. I don't know. I mean, how are you experiencing me saying this, like as this white guy?
I think the lack of voting is quite frustrating. In as much as this year of change is quite critical, it's quite in memoriam of 1994 decision.
Sure.
I know the 1994 decision was quite not a compelling one, but a shifting one, a much needed one, and I think we've had a lot of voter apathy or a lot of voter absence in previous elections, which is quite, especially from our young people, who also feel not represented, as you say, who also feel the lack of, if I vote, what's the point? Nothing changes. The service delivery is still the same. I voted last year and nothing is still the same. My life hasn't moved a needle in any way. So I think it's a catch-22. I mean, it's a tough way to navigate because one, we are thinking about the suffrage that has been fought so hard.
Yeah, exactly.
You're thinking, sure, my ancestors fought blood and tears. Even their lives were on the line.
Of course. For
us to have an opportunity to vote. But now the times have evolved whereby now lesser people are not dying to vote, they are dying not to vote.
Wow. That's an interesting
And I'm thinking to myself, I'm always tied to the stuff like, yes, I want to be a responsible citizen, globally connected. But what does my vote mean? What does it represent? And if you look at the options that we now have, we have almost a collection of lesser evils, I would say. It's either you vote for the devil that you know or the devil that you promises more. Either when all of them are devils. So which one are going to choose? It's not like, okay, cool, as an intersectional body, this party speaks to intersectional policies. As an active, responsible citizen or sustainable enthusiast, this speaks more directly to this. As an economic justice person, this speaks directly to that. There's none, because all of them are devils that we know less of.
Totally.
So it's almost a hard navigation to navigate, and I think in as much as it stems down to a personal level, we have to connect beyond the bigger picture of what does it mean. When you look at the decision in 1994, yes, the ANC was almost a natural choice. Because that was a star hope. But now we're in an era whereby now 30 years into democracy, we've seen what star hopes do. And we have to question critically, like, where do we fit in now into what we represent for the next generation? It's not longer isolated to us. It's more connected to a bigger picture. And I'm always thinking to myself, yes, I registered to vote, fine. But in as much as it's nice to have a public holiday and another public holiday, if there's no voter education at this, like everything's in crisis, everything's in tethers, and you ask yourself, by not voting in abstention, what does that imply?
I mean, it's kind of like, it's funny because like me wanting not to vote felt like me screaming out loud.
Do you think it's the realization of actually knowing that the Rainbow Nation that we've been
is a fallacy?
It's not there.
I think given kind of this work that I do, I've like long understood that the Rainbow Nation was always a fallacy, right? So I don't think I was ever connected to the Rainbow Nation necessarily words, right? Maybe my experience of heartbreak, a very personal experience of community, I think. I really struggle in living in South Africa as a white man many times, but like it's an internal struggle of like seeing inequality, seeing inequality the way we see inequality in South Africa is so traumatic. I'm not even talking about the person who's on the receiving end of that inequality. Like, I'm on the best side of the inequality kind of space, and it is so painful. Like, it's such an injustice for me. So that's heartbreaking, I guess. It's hard to live with, right? Of course it brings up shame and maybe guilt, I don't know, but like, there's a frustration because we want us to be better, right? We want to live in a world that is wonderful for everybody. And it's been really, really difficult for me seeing from age 9, and of course, please just like take this from where it comes. This is a small thing in comparison, but like seeing all of my best friends leave from age 9. I've just had my community every like 5 years. My community just gets decimated, and that's heartbreaking for me.
And I think just to connect with that, I think I also like moving from Joburg or moving from Gauteng to Cape Town. I've been in Cape Town for like more than 10 years now.
Yeah.
And trying to build a sense of community, in a new place where how Cape Town is quite cliquey.
Sure.
It's mostly very easy. It's either you know someone or you have to move through someone that you know. It's a very hard space to even connect and create a sense of community.
I agree.
And when you've had that support, I mean, now talking about mental health as well, I needed a support structure.
Yeah.
Moving into graduation, into work life, into professional life. And that support structure has slowly, bit by bit, been chipping away.
Yeah.
Either someone is moving abroad, someone is relocating. There's a sense of loss.
Yeah, totally.
Almost like you are reliving loss and you think, okay, cool, I'm now from 10, I'm down 5. Okay, cool. Let's see what 5 can do.
Yeah.
Now you're like 2. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
It's like that shrinking.
Yeah.
That drastic shrink which happens without your control.
Yeah.
And how have you now in that resilience marrying it towards well-being or into wellness?
I mean, it is just about community, right? I think what has this idea of like not feeling secure in a space because of a dwindling community has made me really look at this idea of happiness very, very critically, right? What does all the research say about happiness? Not about job, not about money, not about big things, not about materialistic. It's like time and community and health, right? So kind of like as I'm getting older, I think I like have the wisdom of all these big things that we were told as kids were very, very important for our happiness, and now realizing are not really that important for our happiness. So like moving to London and being this big hotshot is no longer like, I look at that and I'm like, that's gross. I definitely don't want that. That's not going to make me happy. What is the research? What does make me happy? Community. Shoo, that's leaving. That is disappearing as I look at it. And that scares me. That makes me very anxious, right? So from a health and wellness perspective, when we know that community is so important, to kind of watch it move away is terrifying, is heartbreaking for me.
Yeah, and I think turning into like the exit narrative, if we were to be other parts of the world, would you look at that and say, this is a ticket for me to go and join a community that better aligns with, like, for example, my happiness era or my happiness aura?
Sure.
Almost. Would you take that, or would you want to embed a change here in the space that you're in?
Oof. Tough question for me to answer. I grew up being told that South Africa was not my home, right? Like, that was my family narrative. This place is not for you. You need to get out. Yes, it was part of like white men don't have opportunity, but my dad is an immigrant, like my dad's mom was, and they never felt at home like they belonged in South Africa. And of course it's deeply racist, of course, right? Like, this is not your home. You do not belong here. And I have always felt the pain of not belonging in South Africa deeply, right? I think part of even why I've invested in doing this work is to try find a sense of belonging. I've always said that for people who put their hand up for DEI work are looking for their own healing. And I believe that. Just ask people about kind of their pain and you will find out why they're, And I felt a deep sense of not belonging. I always have, Do I feel like I belong in Netherlands? No, of course not. What do I know about that place? Nothing. So there is this like limbo that I feel like I have always existed in. So you ask me, would I go elsewhere if I found a community? I don't know. Last year I would have said, oh, absolutely, sign me up, I'm ready to go. This year, got a partner now, loves South Africa, deeply connected to it. Always felt deeply connected to it. Me, never felt deeply connected to it, or rather was forced not to, and have had to really build that. And I'm just asking myself about satisfaction, right? So again, when I said happiness, I was actually talking about satisfaction, because I think that for me is truly what, that's the struggle of our time, is not happiness, is satisfaction. Like, is this enough? And I'm trying to work as a practice on this is enough, at least for right now. This is enough for right now. Because I've literally grown up always saying somewhere else I will be satisfied. And that is lies. That is not true. I would not have been satisfied. I will not be satisfied if I leave. Because the dissatisfaction is not about place. It's about an internal thing. So I am way more interested, for me personally, to find a deeper satisfaction with what I have, rather than think that my satisfaction is going to come from finding something that I don't. Because I know that that's a scam. I know that that's a lie. I will never find it. So it's complex, right? So South Africa becomes a place that is my home, where I don't always feel like I belong, where I may never feel like I belong. And yet belonging is so important to one's satisfaction and sense of safety and well-being and community. It's complex. I don't know, this life is complex.
Would you describe, for example, that disconnection and the complexity as an affirmation for you to continue to doing the work that you're doing? Because I mean, when you think about sense of belonging and centering psychological safety in that sense of belonging, it almost ties directly into that frustration.
I think maybe yes, but I think what it has given me is I'm able to feel what it feels like to not belong. Like, I can come in and I can feel it. It's important that we create this, right? Of course I'm looking for it. And of course I know I'm not going to find it in my work, but I do think, yes, you're right. The drive to kind of create a sense of inclusion and belonging is absolutely because I don't necessarily always feel that. And so it's kind of like a superpower, but also like quite a sadness, and a painful experience. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I go to organizations where Black people, queer people, women don't feel like they belong. And then I'm dealing with white men who do belong there, but who maybe don't feel like they belong in this country. And it's like this weird, we trade a sense of belonging as we enter and exit organizations. Maybe that's why white men hold on so hard. It's like the only place they belong. I'm telling you, there's something about grief and heartbreak and loss that we need to be talking about. Like, how terrifying, I would imagine, to live your whole life in a country and feel like, and never even consider your belonging, right? Or you're not belonging. And then being told that you now need to transform and have something taken away from you. Like, this person needs to have a chat, Does he have the language? No, of course he doesn't. He doesn't know it's grief. He doesn't know it's heartbreak.
Yeah, and at the same time, there's a silence culture as well. Because, I mean, in my history and experience of DEI over the years, most of the priority in terms of intersectionality was always weaponized, in a way, very quick to be weaponized on the narrative of the marginalized, right? Sure. And the privileged conversation has only emerged slightly in the past few years into the space of, okay, now we have to take cognizance of both privilege and disadvantage. Would you say that the fallout of Harvard's president Gay, when one of the investors or the backers of Harvard was detailing their narrative of, I thought DEI, blaming DEI, like it's because of these DEI programs that she is able to, do an insurgency within Harvard. And that's spilled over into that billion dollar question. Like, do we still need DEI? And you read through that lens that, a lot of the frustrations and that loss and that grief has been tied and been married into that silencing culture. You feel frustrated because now you're told to transform. Doubling up on that frustration, would you describe that frustration as to be a sense of reality or a sense of myth almost?
I think it's myth. I think it's a myth. So you say silencing culture, I would call it voicelessness.
Voicelessness, okay.
And it is a both a perceived and a real voicelessness, right? So the way I kind of describe it, like white people, men, straight people feel super voiceless because they know that if they say anything wrong, they're going to be seen as racist, sexist, But also they know that if they don't say anything, even just omission and silence gets interpreted as, they're probably not for this, they're probably like, If I use the wrong tone, right, in asking a question that I'm gonna, so the stakes are super high for white people, men, straight people, right? Super high stakes. But like, I think what is important to understand this full picture is that for people of color, for women, for queer people, in organizations in particular, there's an equal sense of voicelessness. That if you say anything too loudly, with too much emotion, too much passion, you'll be seen as radical, troublemaker, and there's a target on your back, right? Too emotional for your woman, throwing gay in our face. You need to manage your emotions and your tone very, very well. So there's this shared voicelessness that I think we all exist within the space, and part of what my work is, or what I see my work is, coming to a space and recognizing the voicelessness and creating a space where we try and think about what our voice could be within that space, right? That's start like grade 1 stuff. Let's just think about it. Let's just acknowledge that we all feel voiceless, right? Yes, it's cool. How does that, So I think that there is a perceived silencing or voicelessness of white men. Oh, well, my voice is not, you're silencing me. But the reality is that they have such a powerful voice. And it's not the voice in like, oh, I'm now standing up and speaking. It's like the little thing that I say on the side that shut the whole program down because one white guy got frustrated during our talk on anti-racism. That's voice. When they say, I don't think this is good for us. Okay, cool, we scratch it, we fire her. That's voice. So I think it's a perceived thing. But again, it's understanding privilege as needing to play victim, right? Is needing to be seen as under attack. That's how it can make sense of the world, right? Oh, now I am the victim, right? And gives almost this justification, but it is perceived. Does that mean we mustn't create the space for white people, for men, for straight people to talk about their emotions and their anger? And no, of course, we absolutely must. But we just need to deprioritize it. It's just like any other voice that exists within the space.
Yeah. Wow. But I think in closing up this conversation, I think you talked about mostly articulating grief more and loss and temporal transitions towards different spaces of justice and how wellness looks like on the other side. What would you say you are hoping that this journey for yourself takes you towards?
I would love to have a moment where we can demonstrate that doing this work positively impacts our performance. So not seeing DEI as like a weird capitalist, let's extract as much as we can, but like actually when we do this and we show up differently together, when we provide a bit more humanity, when we're actually thinking about who we give trust automatically to, we actually start creating a bit more flow and ease and comfort within a space. And that actually is like, I would absolutely love that. I know that exists, but like, I just need to measure it, see it, feel it for me, and I want to communicate it, right? So like, that is definitely like where I'm laser focused at the moment. I think where I'm hoping we go as a category, or where I've been the whole time, but really want to start bringing it in now, is like thinking about like the psychological elements of exclusion and inclusion, and like bringing it into our conversation, right? Like these things like grief, pain, trauma, fear, loss, joy, satisfaction, wellness, content. Like this is kind of where I think we're going, right? So I don't know how we square up performance and satisfaction, because the fundamental nature of performance is to always be dissatisfied so we can be pushing for more. But like, yeah, I mean, that's kind of it for me, right? So I want us to see a deeper conversation around the psychology. And I mean, just sorry to kind of add a little bit more when we're closing up, but like, if I think about how my parents and our parents respond to mental health, It's like, oh, just don't think about it so much.
Or pray it away.
Pray it away. Like, oh, just don't think about your past though. Like that's, and we have a lot of generation who are in leadership who still kind of buy into that, right? It's like, oh, we don't think about mental health, or just don't think about it, or pray it away, or just like keep going, keep going. And I actually think when I think about inclusive leadership as a skill set, I think for me, the defining and the most obvious inclusive leadership skill set is an understanding of trauma and psychology. That how it is that I grew up is going to fundamentally affect how I show up in this team. And when you as a leader can hold space for that and understand that, you will know how to get the best out of me, because you will know when and why I'm not performing or showing up the way you want me to, and you'll be able to talk me through it. And we kind of create that. Outside of that, it's just like, oh, women must lean in more, Black people must put their hand up more. And it's like, oh, you don't understand why that's not happening. You think it's Bandile's fault that he's not leaning in. That's not how this works. So I'm fascinated by that. I think we need a far more like psychologically, let's call it psychological competence. I think that's what we need to be. That's where I think we're going.
As a well state, how do we build better communities as leaders, or as people who want to build better communities, a sense of community?
For me, it is 100% about creating spaces to talk about our pain. I mean, I'm pain leaning. I know that on the opposite side of pain is joy, and that needs to come in as well. But like, I'm first like, let's start talking about our pain. That's how I think we create more wellness, is by like saying we have a pain, or I have a shared pain, and then when we understand that, we can actually start shifting up. Like, if I know what triggers you, I can shift my behavior to avoid that. Like, that is a shared wellness that you and I can contract without us really contracting. It's like, cool, we're doing this together. And you may not even know that I'm shifting some behaviors, but all of a sudden you feel more comfortable and confident around me. And like, that is what we're doing. So I think understanding pain and trauma is essential to create like a shared sense of wellness. But of course, from a South African perspective, from a DEI perspective, in order for us to do that, as privileged identities, we need to sit with the discomfort that we are perpetrators and that we benefit. So talking about your pain doesn't immediately trigger me to make me feel like I'm a bad person. I can just sit with the discomfort that, this did happen to you, and it's people like me who did it, and you just, so it's this work that this comfort that we need to create around these conversations to get to that point.
Thank you so much, Roy Gluckman, and thank you so much for joining us on today's Total Conversation on Add Ideas podcast, and thank you for following the show, and to more conversations and to more shared spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know what we spoke about.
Well, we spoke about quite a lot.
That's it.
It's quite like a bucket load of interesting conversations and a lot of ideas, like touching points on not just sharing about vulnerability, a sense of losing out or gaining something, or extract and gain, but also just learning a lot about the takeaways of what hopeful change looks like. How do we connect with change personally? I mean, there's a big picture of change that we all want to buy in, that yes, we are all collectiveness, but then that personal narrative is very different from the collective. And I think that today's conversation was quite an eye opener into that lens. So thank you so much for that.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.